Hey there guys, it's me again, RiggerM71. Well, I finally got around to doing another movie review, and this time it's one of my childhood favorites. Now, back before we had Netflix, video rentals, or even cable, kids were pretty limited in terms of movies that ran on television featuring cool stuff that they could get into. Say, for example, dinosaurs. During the late 70s and early 80s, you really only had a couple of choices for getting your dinosaur fix. Your first option was, of course, the Saturday morning TV show Land of the Lost. Technically, Land of the Lost only ran from 1974 to 1976 on NBC, but showed up later in syndication during the 1980s. It featured the adventures of the Marshall family, who fell into an alternate universe inhabited by dinosaurs, primitive people, and a race of lizard bug people called Sleestaks. Although I could do an entire video on this show alone, that's not what I'm here to discuss. Your next option for dinosaurs came in the form of a 1975 movie that seemed to show up on TV at least 2 or 3 times a year. Or at least it seemed that way in the United States. You sort of had to pay attention to the TV guide if you didn't want to miss it, but you could rest easy in the fact that it would always show up eventually. That movie was The Land That Time Forgot. The Land That Time Forgot was based on the 1924 novel of the same name by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Although probably not as popular as his Tarzan and Mars series, it did strike a chord with science fiction readers and managed to stay in the public consciousness long enough to get a movie adaptation. 50 years after it was written and 25 years after Burroughs had died, but whatever. Since Burroughs wasn't available, the task of adapting the book into a screenplay fell on British science fiction author Michael Moorcock. Moorcock has written an impressive number of books over the years, but my favorite has always been the Elric series. The job of directing the film went to Kevin Connor, also British and probably most remembered for directing an assortment of fantasy adventure movies such as At the Earth's Core, Warlords of Atlantis, and even The Land That Time Forgot's 1977 sequel, The People That Time Forgot, which I'll mention again later. Although we know the film was produced by Amicus Productions and distributed by American International Pictures, the budget they had available is somewhat vague. Most sources show it to be somewhere in the range of $1 million. Obviously a great deal of that went toward paying the cast and crew, but much of it clearly had to be sunk into creating the sets, models, and other special effects used throughout the movie. And that's another thing worth talking about: the special effects. Many of you may not remember the state of dinosaur animation pre-Jurassic Park, but there were several techniques available, and none of them were exactly perfect. The earliest of these was probably stop motion, made famous by such films as the original King Kong, as well as films animated by the late, great Ray Harryhausen. This technique involved painstakingly moving models around and taking frame-by-frame shots of the movement. When the film was played back at normal speed, the result was a creature that seemingly moved around on its own. Although masters of stop motion like Harryhausen could put together some incredible sequences, it was sometimes done poorly, or by people not experienced in using the technique. There are few people that use stop motion today, although it can still look great if done right and in the proper context. The other technique most commonly used before the invention of computer-generated effects was puppetry. It was a slightly easier way to get a dinosaur or other creature on the screen, although just like stop motion, it could go either way as far as believability or looking ridiculous. This is the method they used in The Land That Time Forgot. Although one could argue whether the effects were just convincing enough, or just plain silly, the year the film was made definitely has to be taken into consideration. It's worth mentioning that as a kid watching the show on TV, I thought it was the coolest thing ever. The questionable nature of the effects are helped considerably by the addition of a great story. It starts with actors Doug McClure and Susan Penhaligon, I'm sure I butchered her last name, but oh well, stranded in a lifeboat after their ship has been destroyed by a German U-boat. The entire story takes place during the World War I era, which is accurate to Burroughs' original story. Maybe it's just me, but I'm often annoyed by film adaptations that attempt to modernize books written a long time ago. Thankfully, this movie avoided going that route. They are eventually joined by several other survivors, including the ship's captain, and all decide that their only hope of survival is to attempt a takeover of the German U-boat as it surfaces. Amazingly, they manage to pull it off. Unfortunately, one of the German crew members ends up sabotaging the U-boat's compass. Of course, no one realizes this until days later, and they subsequently end up way off course and more than a bit lost. It's at this point that they discover the island of Caprona, a legendary island lost for hundreds of years. Low on food, water, and fuel, they decide to land there and attempt to figure out their next move. It's also at this point that everyone forms an uneasy truce. They all agree to ignore the fact that a war is going on, and work together to explore the island and their options. I won't explain the story any further in case you've never seen this classic film. However, it should be fairly obvious that they encounter a very strange and primitive world on Caprona. Things happen, and ultimately the movie doesn't exactly end well for anyone, but it does set up a basis for the 1977 sequel, The People That Time Forgot, which I would encourage anyone to see as well, especially if you enjoyed the first movie. When you look at the way science fiction and adventure movies are made today, and compare them to the films of 40 years ago, you get some idea just how different film production used to be. Just like the island of Caprona, the land that time forgot offers us an amazing glimpse into the past that we seldom get to see anymore. The past of 1975, pretending to be 1916 and looking like the prehistoric era. It's less confusing than it sounds. Well, that about wraps it up. As always, if you enjoyed this review, please feel free to like or subscribe. And if you have something to add to the topic, you can safely do that in the comments below. Until next time, please take care, and of course, have fun.